Hey guys, tonight we're talking about how Wellington's army actually defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. History textbooks tell you the British won through superior discipline and Wellington's tactical genius. They're lying. On June 18th, 1815, Arthur Wellesley commanded what Napoleon correctly called an infamous army, a thrown-together collection of troops where only 1/3 were actually British. The rest? Dutch-Belgian conscripts who'd fought for Napoleon just 12 months earlier. German farm boys who'd never seen combat. Neosawers carrying muskets designed in 1750. The average British soldier at Waterloo had less combat experience than a modern mall security guard. Wellington himself admitted the night before that he commanded an infamous army, very weak and ill-equipped. Yet this ramshackle coalition destroyed the greatest military mind Europe had ever produced. The emperor who'd won 60 battles, conquered a continent, and made kings tremble lost everything in a single afternoon to an army that shouldn't have been able to march in the same direction, let alone fight. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support, we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about wars. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. You're 19 years old. You've never seen a railroad. You've never questioned that kings rule by divine right. You know Napoleon Bonaparte will kill you today, the way you know rain falls downward. The French emperor conquered Europe while you were still learning to write your name. He'd marched armies to Moscow and back. Every kingdom that faced him crumbled. Now he'd returned from exile, raised another army in 100 days, and your generals were feeding you into his path like meat into a grinder. The smell hit first on the morning of June 18th. Not rain, though God knows it had rained. Not mud, though you stood knee-deep in it. The smell was decay mixed with fear, sweat, and wet wool, horse manure and gunpowder residue from yesterday's fighting at Quatre Bras. Your uniform weighed 20 pounds soaked through. The red coat that marked you as British infantry felt like a target painted on your back. Every soldier knew red showed up beautifully against green fields through a telescope. French artillery officers were probably ranging their guns on you right now. The musket in your hands was India-pattern Brown Bess, 11 pounds of wood and iron that misfired 1 shot in 6 even in dry weather. After last night's downpour, you'd be lucky to get 3 rounds out of 10. The flint needed replacing. The powder in your cartridge box had gotten damp despite the leather covering. Your boots had holes. You'd marched 20 miles in 2 days. You hadn't slept. The biscuit in your pack was mouldy. None of this mattered because across the valley, 72,000 Frenchmen were forming up to kill you. Wellington had positioned his army along a low ridge near a crossroads called Mont Saint-Jean. The position looked brilliant on maps. In reality, you stood on a muddy slope facing a muddy valley, facing another muddy slope where the French waited. Behind you ran the road to Brussels 10 miles north. That road meant 2 things: reinforcement or retreat. Either Wellington's Prussian allies would arrive from the east, or you'd run for your life toward the coast and Britain beyond. The ridge itself barely qualified as high ground. Stand in the valley and the ridge rose perhaps 12 feet above you. Wellington's genius wasn't the height, but how he used the reverse slope. He'd positioned most of his infantry just behind the crest where French artillery observers couldn't see them. You'd lie down when the cannonballs came. You'd stand up when the French infantry advanced. Simple, brutal, effective if the French didn't just walk around the flanks. 3 strong points anchored Wellington's line. On the right flank sat Hougoumont, a chateau and farm complex surrounded by walls, orchards, and a formal garden that would become a graveyard. In the centre left stood La Haye-Sainte, a fortified farm straddling the main Brussels road. On the far left was Papelotte, another farm cluster that barely counted as fortified. These buildings mattered because they projected forward from Wellington's main line. Any French advance had to either capture them or get shredded by flanking fire. Wellington had posted light companies of the Guards to hold Hougoumont, gentlemen soldiers who wore bearskin caps and considered themselves the army's elite. La Haye-Sainte got the King's German Legion, professional soldiers from Hanover who actually knew what they were doing. Papelotte got a mixed bag of Nassauers and Dutch-Belgians. Everyone knew which strong point would hold and which might collapse at the first serious push. The problem was composition. Wellington commanded 68,000 men, arranged in a line about 2.5 miles long. Sounds impressive until you learn the breakdown. Roughly 24,000 British troops, and half of those were raw recruits or second-line militia. Another 17,000 King's German Legion and Hanoverian soldiers, good troops but German-speaking, creating a communication nightmare. Then came 17,000 Dutch-Belgians, many of whom had served in Napoleon's armies until France's collapse in 1814. They'd switched sides because their government switched sides. Their loyalty was theoretical. The remaining 10,000 were a mixture. Brunswickers in black uniforms mourning their duke who died at Caterbrea 2 days earlier, Nassauers carrying outdated weapons, various German principalities' contingents who barely knew each other's languages. 6 different languages spoken along the line. Orders passed from English to German to Dutch, losing precision with each translation. Units that had never trained together. Regiments that didn't trust their neighbours. Wellington later admitted he'd spent the entire battle not planning attacks but preventing panics. One Dutch-Belgian brigade would break and run before the day ended. Others would hold. Nobody knew which until the shooting started. The French army waiting across the valley had none of these problems. Napoleon commanded veterans. These men had marched across Europe for a decade. They'd fought in Egypt, Spain, Russia, Germany. They knew their officers, trusted their system, believed in their emperor. The Imperial Guard had never been defeated. French cavalry had shattered every army they'd charged. French artillery was the finest in the world. French infantry columns had smashed through Austrian lines, Prussian lines, Russian lines, Spanish lines. Only the British infantry squares had consistently stopped them, and Wellington didn't have enough British infantry to form a proper line. Napoleon himself had spent the night at Le Caillou Farm, a 1.5 miles south of Wellington's position. He'd eaten breakfast while discussing how quickly he'd destroy that sepoy general, his contemptuous term for Wellington based on the Duke's service in India. Napoleon told his officers the battle would be a simple affair: artillery bombardment to soften Wellington's centre, infantry assault to break it, cavalry pursuit to annihilate the fleeing British before the Prussians arrived. They'd be in Brussels by nightfall. The Emperor's certainty came from experience. He'd won 60 battles using similar plans. He'd faced larger armies, better positioned armies, more unified armies. He'd beaten them all. Wellington's mixed force of questionable troops holding a low ridge with swampy ground behind them presented no special challenge. The only variable was time. Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher were somewhere to the east. If they arrived before Wellington broke, Napoleon would face a two-front battle. But Blücher's army had been mauled 2 days earlier at Ligny. Napoleon assumed they'd retreated north, away from the battlefield. Even if they turned toward Waterloo, the roads were a morass from the rain. They'd arrived too late. This assumption would kill the French Empire. But at 6 a.m. on June 18th, standing in the mud on Wellington's Ridge, you didn't know any of this. You knew only that the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking. Across the valley, French campfires multiplied as soldiers woke and formed ranks. Drums began beating. Bugles sounded. The army that had conquered Europe was preparing to add your corpse to its legacy. Your sergeant walked the line, checking flints and powder. He was a 20-year veteran who'd fought in the peninsula, a hard man with scars on his face and missing teeth. He stopped in front of you, examined your musket, grunted approval. Then he said something you'd remember forever, though you didn't understand it yet. He said, "They'll come at us the same old way, and we'll beat them the same old way." The same old way meant French columns against British lines, infantry firepower against infantry mass. It had worked in Spain. It had worked in Portugal. Whether it would work here with half your line speaking Dutch and German, nobody knew. The sun broke through around 9 a.m. Steam rose from the wet ground. You could see the French clearly now, mass after mass of blue-coated infantry, green-uniformed cavalry, grey-coated artillery crews. They looked infinite. Wellington's intelligence estimated 70,000 Frenchmen. The actual count was 72,000. Against your 68,000, that meant rough parity except for the quality difference. Napoleon's troops were professionals. Yours were amateurs pretending otherwise. Wellington rode along the ridge on his horse Copenhagen, a chestnut thoroughbred that would carry him through the entire battle. The Duke wore a dark blue coat, white breeches, and a low-cocked hat. He looked nothing like the hero of paintings. He was 46 years old, thin-faced, hook-nosed, with an expression of permanent skepticism. He spoke to almost no one. He gave few orders. He'd learned in Spain that the less he told subordinate commanders, the less they could misunderstand. His strategy was patience. Let Napoleon attack. Make the French come uphill through mud into musket range. Bleed them. Hold on. Wait for the Prussians. Everything depended on whether Blücher would come. The Prussian field marshal had promised to march to Wellington's aid. But Blücher was 72 years old, recovering from being trapped under his dead horse at Ligny, possibly concussed, definitely in pain. His army had retreated to Wavre, 11 miles east. The roads between Wavre and Waterloo were sunken lanes turned to soup by the rain. Moving 50,000 men with artillery through that terrain would take hours, maybe all day, maybe too long. Wellington had sent officers to observe the Prussian approach. They reported back around 10 a.m. Blücher was marching. His advance guard had left Wavre at dawn. But the pace was agonizing. Miles of infantry and guns struggling through knee-deep mud. At this rate, the first Prussian troops might reach the battlefield by early afternoon. Might. Wellington did his mathematics. He needed to hold 6 hours minimum, possibly 8, against Napoleon, with an infamous army. The French still hadn't attacked. Napoleon had delayed the assault, waiting for the ground to dry enough for his artillery to manoeuvre. Wet soil absorbed cannonball impacts, reducing their effectiveness. The Emperor wanted his guns to work properly. This delay, eventually it would stretch to 11:30 a.m., gave Wellington's army 3 extra hours to prepare. More critically, it gave Blücher 3 extra hours to march. The decision showed Napoleon's supreme confidence. He had time. Wellington wasn't going anywhere. The British general would stand and fight because retreat with such a polyglot force would dissolve into chaos. Around 11 a.m., French skirmishers began probing Wellington's line. These were light infantry who fought in loose order, taking potshots at the British positions. They were testing for weak points, drawing fire to see where troops were concentrated. Wellington's own skirmishers, rifles from the 95th Regiment in their green jackets, exchanged shots with them. This wasn't the battle yet. This was the overture. You checked your equipment again. 60 rounds in the cartridge box. Each paper cartridge contained powder and a .75 caliber lead ball. The loading procedure you'd practiced 1,000 times. Bite the cartridge open, pour a bit of powder in the pan, Close the pan, pour the rest down the barrel, ram the ball and paper down on top, cock, aim, fire. A good soldier could manage 3 shots per minute in perfect conditions. Today would not be perfect conditions. You'd be lucky to get 2. The formation you'd fight in was a 2-deep line. British infantry had abandoned the 3-deep line used by most European armies. Wellington wanted maximum firepower, and 2 ranks both firing forward delivered more lead than 3 ranks where the third couldn't shoot. The downside was fragility. A 2-deep line could shatter under a determined charge. Everything depended on volleys stopping the French before they reached bayonet range. At 11:30 a.m. the French artillery opened fire. Not the main bombardment yet. This was ranging shots, testing distances. Cannonballs came arcing over the valley, black spheres moving slow enough to track with your eyes. They looked harmless until they hit. One ball struck the ground 50 yards in front of your company, bounced, and took a Dutch-Belgian soldier's head clean off his shoulders. The body stood for a second, blood fountaining before collapsing. Nobody moved to help. You couldn't help the dead, and moving from position during artillery fire meant flogging or worse. The real bombardment was coming. 80 French guns were wheeling into position. Grand Battery, they called it. The largest concentration of artillery Napoleon had ever assembled for a single attack. Those guns would fire at your position until the ground itself screamed. Then the infantry would come, then the cavalry. Then either you'd be dead, or Wellington's infamous army would have done the impossible. The man next to you was praying. The man beyond him was crying silently. You stood between them, musket in hand, watching the French prepare to end your life. The sun climbed higher. The mud steamed. Across the valley, Napoleon raised his hand. The battle for Europe was about to begin. The Grand Battery unleashed hell at 11:30 a.m. precisely. 80 French guns firing in sequence created a rolling thunder that shook the ground beneath Wellington's ridge. Each discharge sent a 12-pound iron ball screaming across the valley at 1,000 feet per second. The ball struck mud, bounced upward at waist height, and carved through formations like scythes through wheat. A single shot could kill 6 men standing in line. Wellington had anticipated this. His troops lay flat behind the ridge crest, invisible to French artillery observers. The cannonballs sailed overhead or buried themselves harmlessly in soft earth. The French gunners realized their mistake within minutes. They couldn't see their targets because of the reverse slope positioning. Artillery officers galloped forward to adjust range, exposing themselves to British rifle fire. 3 went down in the first 10 minutes. The guns kept firing anyway, blasting the ridge crest into a fog of dirt and smoke. Wellington's concealed infantry suffered surprisingly light casualties, maybe 200 men in the first hour of bombardment. But the psychological effect was devastating. Lying prone while cannonballs screamed overhead required inhuman discipline. Men vomited from fear. Some ran. British officers shot deserters on the spot to maintain order. The Dutch-Belgian brigades positioned on Wellington's left took the bombardment worst. These troops had minimal combat experience and even less reason to die for Britain. Their officers spoke Flemish or French, creating confusion when orders came down in English. One Nassau battalion, hearing the word retreat mistranslated, began falling back without authorization. Their brigade commander rode after them personally, sword drawn, threatening to cut down the first man who took another step backward. The battalion stopped, barely. Wellington watched this near collapse through his telescope and immediately shifted British troops to stiffen that sector. The King's German Legion held the centre with professional calm. These Hanoverian soldiers fought for Britain because Napoleon had annexed their homeland. They hated the French with personal fury that made them reliable. Their officers understood English, spoke German to their troops, and maintained iron discipline. Wellington trusted them more than half his British units. The Legion's riflemen at La Haye-Sainte farmhouse were already exchanging shots with French skirmishers, holding the crucial position that jutted forward from the main line like a stone in Napoleon's boot. La Haye-Sainte itself was a typical Belgian farm. Thick-walled buildings surrounding a courtyard, a large barn, an orchard to the south, a kitchen garden to the north. Major George Bering commanded the 2nd Light Battalion defending it, about 400 Germans armed with Baker rifles, the most accurate weapon on the battlefield. The rifles could kill at 300 yards versus 100 for muskets. But rifles took twice as long to reload, and Bering's men had been issued the wrong caliber ammunition. They'd started the day with 60 rounds each. That was all they'd get. Bering had sent desperate messages requesting resupply. Nobody had answered. The farmhouse's main gate faced south toward the French. Bering's men had barricaded it with carts and furniture, creating a firing position that dominated the road. French skirmishers approached within 50 yards, took casualties, fell back. The pattern repeated. Every dead Frenchman bought Wellington minutes. Every rifle shot from La Haye-Sainte reminded Napoleon that the British centre wouldn't collapse easily. The farm had to be taken before any major assault could succeed. Napoleon knew this. He had already assigned troops for the job. On Wellington's right flank, Hougoumont presented an even stronger defensive position. The chateau itself was a sprawling complex, a manor house, chapel, formal gardens, barn, orchards, woods, all enclosed by thick walls with limited access points. Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonell commanded the guards, light companies holding it, about 1,500 men, mostly British elite troops with a handful of Hanoverian and Nassau reinforcements. They'd spent the morning fortifying every building, loopholing walls for musket fire, preparing the killing ground. The woods south of Hougoumont extended nearly to the French lines. These trees blocked artillery observation and provided covered approach routes. Wellington had ordered them defended but not held. Let the French come through the woods, emerge into the open ground before the buildings, and die in the crossfire. MacDonell positioned his men accordingly. The gamekeeper's cottage at the wood's edge got a small garrison. The garden walls got marksmen. The main gate got a reserve force ready to respond anywhere. Prince Jérôme Bonaparte, Napoleon's youngest brother, commanded the French division tasked with taking Hougoumont. Jérôme was brave, impulsive, and desperate to prove himself worthy of the Bonaparte name. He'd been given explicit orders: demonstrate against Hougoumont to draw British reserves away from the centre. A feint, nothing more. But Jérôme saw those walls and decided to take them for real. Glory beckoned. His division began forming up for assault. Wellington watched the French movements through his telescope and immediately understood Napoleon's plan. The Emperor would pin British reserves at Hougoumont while smashing through the centre. Textbook tactics. Wellington's counter was simple: garrison Hougoumont with enough troops to hold, but not enough to tempt him into reinforcing failure. Let the French waste men attacking a fortified position. Every Frenchman dying at Hougoumont was one not attacking the main line. The chateau became a strategic mousetrap baited with British guards. The language barrier nearly destroyed this plan before fighting even started. A Hanoverian battalion positioned near Hougoumont received orders to support the chateau if pressed. The German commander interpreted this as advance to the chateau immediately. He marched his entire battalion forward, exposing them to French artillery. Wellington spotted the mistake, sent a galloper racing over with corrected orders. The Hanoverians withdrew just before French cavalry scouts could cut them off. Crisis averted by 60 seconds. These near disasters plagued Wellington's polyglot army constantly. A British brigade commander ordered his Dutch-Belgian counterpart to refuse the flank, military terminology for angling part of the line backward to prevent encirclement. The Dutch officer thought he was being told to retreat. His brigade began pulling back. British troops on their right, seeing the movement, assumed a general withdrawal had been ordered. They started backward too. Wellington personally rode into the confusion, pointing troops back into position with his cane. The Duke never raised his voice. He never showed anger. He simply indicated where men should stand and expected them to stand there. Most did. The Brunswickers presented a different problem entirely. These German troops wore black uniforms with death's head insignia, mourning their duke who'd been killed leading them at Quatre Bras. They were volunteers, relatively well trained, adequately equipped. But their commander had died and been replaced by a colonel who'd never led more than a regiment. The Brunswick Corps occupied Wellington's centre-left, a crucial position. If they broke, the entire line collapsed. Wellington assigned British liaison officers to shadow the Brunswick commanders, providing guidance disguised as suggestions. Behind Wellington's line, the Brussels road ran north toward the city in safety. This road meant everything. If the battle went badly, the army would retreat along it. If it went well, supplies and reinforcements would arrive on it. And somewhere to the east, converging on this road from Wavre, Blücher's Prussians were marching. Wellington sent another officer to observe their progress. The report came back around noon. The Prussians were moving but slowly. Advance elements might reach the battlefield by 4 p.m. Might. 4 hours to survive. Wellington had to hold 4 hours minimum against Napoleon's assault before help arrived. His 68,000 troops facing 72,000 French veterans with better artillery, better cavalry, and unified command. The mathematics of attrition favoured Napoleon significantly. Each French casualty could be more easily replaced from reserves because Napoleon's army operated as a coherent whole. Each Allied casualty weakened an already fragile coalition. If the Dutch-Belgians broke, the line collapsed. If the Brunswickers panicked, same result. If the Germans retreated, disaster. Wellington's genius wasn't inspiring these disparate forces. It was preventing them from falling apart long enough to win. The ridge position helped enormously. That 12-foot rise didn't sound like much, but it meant French attacks came uphill through mud into concentrated musket fire. The reverse slope meant Wellington could shift reserves invisibly, moving troops from quiet sectors to threatened ones without French observers noticing. The farm strongpoints anchored his flanks and centre, forcing Napoleon to either capture them or accept flanking fire on any advance. And the sunken road running along parts of the ridge provided a natural trench for troops to shelter in. But the ridge had disadvantages too. The ground behind Wellington's line sloped down to marshy terrain and the forest of Soignies. If forced to retreat through a forest with a polyglot army speaking 6 languages, the withdrawal would become a rout. Napoleon knew this. He planned to drive Wellington back into the forest and annihilate him there. The ridge was a trap as much as a fortress. Wellington had to win here or lose everything. The first Prussian liaison officer arrived at Wellington's headquarters around 12:30 p.m. He confirmed Blücher was marching and promised that 50,000 men would arrive by late afternoon. Wellington asked for specifics: which roads, which units, what time. The officer couldn't say. Prussian staff work was chaotic at the best of times, and they were marching through conditions that made planning impossible. The only certainty was that help was coming, eventually. Wellington thanked him and sent him back with a message: come faster. French skirmisher fire intensified around 1 p.m. as Napoleon's assault formations began moving into position. The skirmishers weren't trying to take ground, They were identifying British defensive positions and drawing fire to mark gun emplacements. Wellington's skirmishers gave ground slowly, falling back to the main line while maintaining harassing fire. This fighting killed dozens but meant nothing strategically. The real battle waited for Napoleon's signal. Down in the French lines, officers were briefing their troops on the assault plan. General d'Erlon commanded 1st Corps, 16,000 infantry organised into 4 divisions. These divisions would advance in massive columns toward Wellington's left centre, the point where British and German troops met. The theory was elegant. Column formations concentrated tremendous force at a narrow point. If the columns broke through, they'd split Wellington's line and roll it up from inside. Spanish, Austrian, Prussian and Russian armies had shattered under this tactic. British armies had not. Wellington's men formed lines and shot columns to pieces before they made contact. d'Erlon's officers knew this. They'd fought in Spain and learned the hard way that British musketry stopped French columns cold. But they also knew that Wellington didn't have enough British troops to cover his entire line with proper British formations. The left centre was held partly by Germans, partly by Dutch-Belgians. If those troops wavered even slightly, the columns would burst through. Napoleon was betting that Wellington's polyglot army couldn't deliver the same disciplined volleys that had won the peninsula. The columns began forming at 1 p.m. Each division formed in a different configuration, some in battalion columns, some in deeper masses. The formations varied because d'Erlon's divisional commanders had received unclear orders and improvised based on experience. This meant the assault wouldn't hit Wellington's line in a coordinated wave but in sequential hammer-blow strikes. Bad tactics. But when you commanded 16,000 men advancing against a position held by maybe 8,000, tactics mattered less than mass. Wellington watched the French preparations and shifted reserves slightly leftward. He pulled a Dutch-Belgian brigade back into second line, replacing them with British troops who moved up at the last moment. The Dutch commander protested, claiming his men were ready to fight. Wellington ignored him. This wasn't about courage, it was about firepower discipline. The Duke needed troops who'd stand in line taking casualties while firing volleys on command. Dutch conscripts might do it. British regulars would do it. The difference between might and would was everything. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about wars. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. At 1:15 p.m, French drums began beating the pas de charge, the distinctive rhythm that signalled advance to contact. The sound carried across the valley, a rhythmic boom, boom, boom that every soldier recognised. British veterans who'd fought in Spain felt their stomachs clench. They knew what came next. The newer troops just knew the sound meant death was walking toward them. Wellington rode along the line one final time, stopping briefly at each battalion. He said almost nothing. His presence was the message. I am here, I am watching, do your duty. The Duke positioned himself near the crossroads where he could observe most of the battlefield. His staff clustered nearby, liaison officers, aides de camp, map carriers. They formed a conspicuous target on horseback. French artillery observers spotted the group and directed fire at it. Shells burst nearby. Wellington never flinched. His staff took casualties throughout the day, but the Duke's calm was unshakable. This performance mattered more than any speech. If Wellington looked confident, the army might believe they could win. At 1:30 p.m, Jérôme Bonaparte's division stepped off toward Hougoumont. 6,000 Frenchmen advancing through the woods in the war's opening infantry assault. The demonstration that was supposed to be a feint was becoming a full battle within the battle. And in the centre, d'Erlon's massive columns were beginning to march. The careful timing Napoleon had planned was already falling apart. The Hougoumont assault was too strong. The main attack was too scattered. But 22,000 Frenchmen were moving, and Wellington's infamous army was about to discover whether it could actually fight. Napoleon watched the assault begin from a ridge south of La Belle Alliance Inn, surrounded by his Imperial Guard. The Emperor sat on a camp chair eating chicken, occasionally gesturing with a drumstick towards sectors of the battlefield. His confidence bordered on theatrical. He'd told Marshal Soult that morning they had a 90% chance of success and a 10% chance of total victory. Defeat wasn't on the menu. The man who'd conquered Europe didn't lose to Anglo-German mongrel armies commanded by a general who'd made his reputation fighting hill tribes in India. The Emperor's certainty rested on mathematics and experience. His 72,000 troops outnumbered Wellington slightly, but quality mattered more than quantity. French infantry had smashed every continental army they'd faced. French cavalry had ridden down Prussians, Austrians, Russians. French artillery was the Revolution's gift to warfare. Mobile, accurate, devastating. Wellington commanded shopkeepers in red coats and German farmers playing soldier. The outcome was predetermined. Only the body count remained uncertain. This certainty had already cost Napoleon 3 critical hours. He delayed the attack from 9 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. waiting for the ground to dry. Wet soil absorbed cannon impacts, reducing artillery effectiveness by half. Better to wait for sunshine than waste ammunition on mud. The decision was tactically sound and strategically catastrophic. Each hour of delay gave Blücher's Prussians another hour to march from Wavre. But Napoleon had dismissed intelligence reports about Prussian movements. His chief of staff, Soult, had urged caution, suggesting the Prussians might arrive by afternoon. The Emperor had waved this away. Blücher's army was shattered, retreating north toward Prussia. Even if they turned toward Waterloo, the roads were impassable. Marshal Grouchy commanded 33,000 French troops pursuing Blücher eastward. Napoleon had sent him explicit orders: stay between the Prussians and Wellington, prevent them from combining forces. Grouchy had followed these orders meticulously, marching away from the sound of the guns at Waterloo toward Prussian rearguards at Wavre. This split Napoleon's forces and removed a third of his strength from the decisive battle. Worse, Grouchy's pursuit was pushing Blücher's army westward, directly toward Wellington. The Emperor's dispositions were herding the Prussians into position to destroy him. But Napoleon on the morning of June 18th knew none of this. He believed Grouchy had Blücher pinned. He believed Wellington was trapped against the forest of Soignies. He believed the British would break within 2 hours of serious fighting. These beliefs came from experience. Napoleon had won 60 battles by doing exactly what he planned to do today: concentrate artillery, smash the centre, pursue the fragments. Against Russian squares at Austerlitz, Prussian lines at Jena, Austrian masses at Wagram, the formula worked. Why wouldn't it work now? The artillery bombardment that opened at 11:30 a.m. was supposed to break Wellington's line before infantry ever advanced. 80 guns firing for 30 minutes should have torn gaps in the British formations, demoralised the troops, made them easy prey for column assault. Instead, Wellington's reverse slope positioning neutralised most of the barrage. French gunners were firing at hilltops while British infantry sheltered just behind them. Napoleon observed this through his telescope and refused to acknowledge the problem. His artillery was the finest in Europe. If they weren't achieving visible results, it meant the British were already broken and hiding. Attack now before they recovered. Marshal Ney commanded Napoleon's left wing, the forces that would conduct the main assault. Michel Ney was the bravest man in France, possibly Europe. He'd charged into Russian squares, led desperate rearguard actions, fought duels with enemy cavalry. Napoleon called him the bravest of the brave. This bravery came with recklessness that bordered on suicidal. Ney had been shot multiple times, had horses killed under him in virtually every battle, suffered what modern doctors would call severe PTSD. He'd fought too long, seen too much death. His tactical judgment was impaired by a decade of trauma that made him see every battle as a cavalry charge waiting to happen. Napoleon gave Ney vague orders: attack Wellington's left centre, break through, pursue. The Emperor trusted Ney's aggression to carry the day. This trust was misplaced. Ney's mental state in June 1815 was fragile. He'd switched sides against Napoleon during the Emperor's first abdication, sworn loyalty to the Bourbon king, then switched back when Napoleon returned from Elba. This betrayal and return cycle had shattered his confidence. He fought now with desperate fury, trying to prove loyalty through valour. Subtlety was beyond him. He would throw men at British guns until either the British broke or the men ran out. d'Erlon's corps stepping off at 1:30 p.m. represented Napoleon's main effort. 16,000 infantry in massive columns. The formations were wrong from the start. d'Erlon had organised his divisions in huge battalion masses, each division presenting a frontage of maybe 200 men and a depth of 24 ranks. These columns were designed to smash through enemy lines by sheer weight. They worked against armies that panicked under pressure. Against troops who stood and fired disciplined volleys, columns became killing zones. Every musket ball that hit the front ranks travelled through multiple men before stopping. The columns advanced accompanied by horse artillery and covered by swarms of skirmishers. These light infantry ranged ahead, shooting at British positions to suppress return fire. The tactic was sound, except Wellington's troops were lying down behind the ridge crest. The skirmishers had nothing to shoot at. They wasted ammunition on empty hilltops while the columns marched uphill through mud that sucked at boots and slowed the pace to a crawl. The mathematical advantage of mass was dissolving with each yard they advanced. French military doctrine assumed that British troops would fire one volley, maybe two, then either retreat or get overrun before reloading. This doctrine came from fighting continental armies with poorly trained conscripts. Wellington's British infantry could fire 3 volleys per minute in good conditions. More importantly, they'd been drilled to fire in coordinated company volleys on command. The front rank knelt, the rear rank stood, both fired simultaneously. Reload. Repeat. A British line could put out sustained fire that no column could endure at close range. Napoleon had fought British troops exactly once before, at Toulon in 1793 when he was an unknown artillery captain. He'd never faced Wellington's Peninsular veterans. The Emperor's knowledge of British tactics came second-hand from marshals who'd fought in Spain. Those marshals had uniformly failed against Wellington. Napoleon dismissed their failures as incompetence rather than systemic weakness in French doctrine. He believed his presence on the battlefield would make the difference. Imperial prestige would carry his troops through whatever resistance the British offered. The Emperor's command position at La Belle Alliance gave him excellent observation of the valley, but poor perspective on the ridge itself. He could see his troops advancing, but couldn't see Wellington's dispositions clearly because of the reverse slope. This meant Napoleon was commanding blind, relying on reports from subordinates who were themselves advancing through smoke and chaos. Marshal Ney would send back wildly inaccurate assessments throughout the battle. Napoleon would make critical decisions based on false information. The communication breakdown was baked into French doctrine. Centralised command required accurate intelligence upward, but the battlefield environment made accuracy impossible. The delay in attacking had another consequence Napoleon hadn't considered. His troops had spent the night in rain-soaked fields, same as Wellington's. They were cold, hungry, exhausted. The 3-hour wait before battle let them dry off and eat breakfast, which was positive, but it also let them think. Veterans knew what British musketry could do. The newer conscripts absorbed the veterans' nervousness. Morale in French ranks was lower than Napoleon realised. They'd win because the Emperor commanded them, but the certainty that carried them through earlier battles was absent. Napoleon had returned from Elba only 100 days earlier. This army was improvised, rebuilt quickly, not the instrument that had conquered Europe. French cavalry massed behind the infantry columns, 15,000 horsemen in cuirasses and breastplates, carrying sabres and lances. These were the finest heavy cavalry in the world. They'd shattered Austrian squares, ridden down Russian infantry, pursued fleeing Prussians for miles, against Wellington's mixed army with its questionable Dutch-Belgian contingents. They should dominate. Cavalry's role today was exploitation. Once the infantry columns broke Wellington's line, the horsemen would charge through the gap and turn retreat into massacre. This was standard Napoleonic combined arms doctrine. It had worked 40 times before. The assumption underlying everything was speed. Napoleon needed to break Wellington before the Prussians arrived. Every minute mattered. Yet the Emperor had wasted 3 hours waiting for dry ground, and now his infantry was advancing at a crawl through mud. The timeline was slipping. Napoleon noticed but wasn't concerned. Blücher couldn't arrive before 3 p.m. at earliest, probably much later. The Emperor had hours. Wellington would break within 1. Around 2 p.m. reports reached Napoleon about Prussian forces spotted to the northeast near the village of Chapelle-Saint-Lambert. The Emperor studied the distant formations through his telescope. They might be Prussians, they might be Grouchy's corps arriving from the east, or they might be nothing, trees, shadows, retreating stragglers. Napoleon decided they were Grouchy. He sent a cavalry patrol to verify but didn't adjust his battle plan. The main attack was already committed. Pulling back now would surrender initiative and demoralise the troops. Forward was the only option. The forces spotted near Chapelle-Saint-Lambert were definitely Prussian, advance elements of Blücher's 4th Corps under General Bülow. They'd covered 11 miles from Wavre through conditions that should have been impossible. Blücher himself was riding with them despite his injuries, demanding speed, threatening stragglers, promising his men they'd save Wellington and destroy Napoleon. The old field marshal understood what Napoleon refused to believe. This was the decisive battle of the war. Whoever won today would control Europe. Losing wasn't acceptable. Being late wasn't acceptable. Blücher's troops marched beyond exhaustion because their commander willed them forward. Napoleon's ignorance of the Prussian approach was partly his own fault and partly bad luck. French cavalry screens that should have detected Bülow's corps were positioned wrong because Napoleon assumed Prussians would retreat north, not march west. The cavalry patrol sent out that morning had ridden east toward Wavre instead of northeast toward the actual Prussian approach route. This meant 30,000 Prussians were moving into position on Napoleon's flank, and French headquarters didn't know until they were 6 miles away. At 2:15 p.m. the distant formations were positively identified as Prussian. A staff officer brought Napoleon the report. The Emperor read it, crumpled the paper, threw it aside. He had time. Durland's assault was about to strike Wellington's line. The British would break in minutes. Then French cavalry would pursue while infantry pivoted to face the Prussians. Napoleon had fought on 2 fronts before. He'd beaten combined armies before. His certainty never wavered even as the strategic situation deteriorated. The Emperor's final critical mistake was dividing his attention. With Prussians approaching from the east, Napoleon should have either withdrawn and repositioned to fight on better ground, or committed everything to destroying Wellington immediately before help arrived. Instead, he did neither. He continued the methodical assault on Wellington while detaching troops to watch the Prussian approach. This guaranteed he'd fight 2 battles simultaneously, with insufficient force for either. But Napoleon's confidence in his own genius made alternatives unthinkable. He would win because he always won. The British were shopkeepers, the Prussians were exhausted. The Emperor would destroy both before dinner. Down in the valley, d'Erlon's columns were climbing Wellington's ridge. French drums beat the pas de charge. 15,000 voices roared, "Vive l'Empereur!" The sound carried across the battlefield, a rolling thunder of human voices meant to terrorize defenders. British troops lying behind the ridge crest heard it and checked their muskets. The mathematics of the coming collision was simple. French mass against British firepower, column against line, Napoleon's certainty against Wellington's discipline. Someone's theory of warfare was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Jérôme Bonaparte's assault on Hougoumont began with artillery fire that set the woods south of the chateau ablaze. Trees exploded into splinters under round-shot impact. Branches crashed down on French infantry struggling through the undergrowth. The woods were supposed to provide concealed approach routes to the buildings. Instead, they became a furnace as dry leaves caught fire from shell bursts. French soldiers emerged from the tree line coughing smoke, faces blackened, formations disrupted. British guards positioned in the chateau's garden opened fire at 70 yards. The first volley dropped 60 Frenchmen. Guardsmen firing from loopholed walls had perfect fields of fire across the clearing between woods and buildings. Every French soldier crossing that space was exposed. Jérôme's men charged anyway because their prince was watching, and Bonaparte pride demanded it. They made it halfway before the second volley shredded their front ranks. The attack collapsed. Survivors scrambled back into the burning woods. Jérôme immediately ordered another assault. The demonstration that was supposed to draw British reserves away from Wellington's centre had become a matter of family honour. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonell watched from the chateau's north gate as wave after wave of French infantry emerged from the woods only to be cut down. The mathematics favoured defence overwhelmingly. His 1,500 guardsmen were protected by thick walls with limited entry points. Attackers had to cross open ground under fire, then somehow breach walls or gates while being shot from above. Standard siege doctrine said you needed 10 attackers for every defender to take a fortified position. Jérôme had barely 4 to 1, but the Bonaparte prince kept sending his division forward anyway, feeding companies into the killing ground like logs into a fire. The French changed tactics after the third failed frontal assault. Instead of massed attacks across the clearing, they infiltrated through the woods to the east and west, trying to surround the chateau complex. Small units worked forward using the orchard trees as cover. British defenders in the gardener's cottage on the eastern approach found themselves engaged in close-range firefight with French light infantry, who'd gotten within 30 yards. The cottage garrison, maybe 40 Nassauers and Hanoverians, held for 20 minutes before being overwhelmed. French troops now controlled the eastern orchard. This penetration threatened the entire defensive position. From the eastern orchard, French marksmen could fire into the chateau's courtyard and main gate. MacDonell had to retake the ground or risk losing the whole complex. He pulled a company of Coldstream Guards from the north wall and led them personally into the orchard. The fighting became savage hand-to-hand combat among the apple trees. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. Guardsmen drove the French back through sheer ferocity, retaking the cottage and pushing the survivors back into the woods. MacDonell returned to the main buildings having lost 18 men in 10 minutes. Around 2 p.m, Jérôme committed his entire division to taking Hougoumont regardless of cost. 6,000 Frenchmen attacked simultaneously from south, east, and west. The defenders' ammunition was running low. MacDonell sent urgent requests to Wellington for resupply. The Duke sent back a single wagon of ammunition escorted by cavalry, but also a message: hold Hougoumont at all costs. No reinforcements were coming. The chateau had to survive on what it had. Wellington understood the strategic value perfectly. Every Frenchman dying at Hougoumont was one not attacking his main line. Let Jérôme waste his division. MacDonald just had to make sure the division died outside the walls, not inside them. The western approach to Hougoumont featured a formal garden with manicured hedges and gravel paths that became a corpse-filled maze. French infantry advanced using the hedges for cover, only to discover British guards had positioned themselves in the garden pavilions and behind the walls. Crossfire killed the attackers in the open spaces between hedges. The garden's beauty made the slaughter more grotesque. Well-dressed flower beds became mass graves. The ornamental pond filled with bodies. A marble fountain's cherub statuary smiled at men bleeding out on decorative stonework. The main assault focused on Hougoumont South Gate, a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bars, the chateau's primary entrance. French troops had brought up a pioneer company with axes and crowbars to break through. British defenders fired down from windows above the gate, dropping grenades made from powder-filled canvas bags. Each explosion scattered iron nails and stone fragments. The French pioneers persisted, hacking at the door while men died around them. The wood began to splinter. MacDonald reinforced the gate from inside with furniture and timbers, creating a barricade behind the door even as axes bit through from outside. At 2:30 p.m., a French lieutenant named Legros led 30 men in a desperate rush at the south gate. Legros was enormous, 6 feet tall and powerfully built, nicknamed l'enfonceur, the smasher, for his ability to break through obstacles. He charged the gate with an axe, his men following with a log as a battering ram. British fire killed half the group instantly. Legros kept coming. He crashed into the gate with the log. The weakened wood gave way. The gate swung open. French troops poured through into the courtyard. MacDonald and his Coldstream Guards were positioned exactly for this moment. They'd prepared for gate breach as an inevitability. The moment French soldiers entered the courtyard, Guardsmen hit them from 3 sides. Close-range musket fire followed by bayonet charge. The confined space negated French numerical advantage. Only a few men could fight at once. British training and fury overwhelmed the attackers within seconds. But more French were pushing through the gate. MacDonald realised that if the gate stayed open, the flow would never stop. French reinforcements would pour in faster than his men could kill them. 4 guardsmen, MacDonald, 2 brothers named Graham, and an Irish soldier named Joseph Brewster, threw their shoulders against the gate from inside while French troops tried to force it wider from outside. Other guardsmen shot point-blank at Frenchmen in the gateway, preventing them from gaining leverage. The 4 men heaved. The gate moved. Inch by inch they forced it closed despite French soldiers literally being crushed between the gate and frame. One Frenchman's arm was caught in the closing gate. A guardsman severed it with a sword stroke. The gate slammed shut. Guardsmen dropped the bar into place. The breach was sealed. 30 French soldiers had entered the courtyard. 29 were already dead or dying. The last one was a young drummer boy named Cyrus, who'd followed Legros through the gate and was too terrified to fight. Guardsmen found him hiding behind a wagon. MacDonald ordered him spared, the only French prisoner taken at Hougoumont all day. The boy was marched to the rear under guard while French troops outside resumed attacking the closed gate. Legros lay dead in the courtyard, his skull crushed by musket butts. The smasher had smashed through Wellington's defences for exactly 90 seconds before being killed. The fight for the south gate became legendary immediately. Wellington later said the closing of the gate at Hougoumont was the decisive action of the entire battle. If the French had held the gate open for 5 more minutes, reinforcements would have captured the chateau. From there they could enfilade Wellington's right flank, forcing him to commit reserves that he desperately needed elsewhere. Instead, MacDonald and 4 guardsmen had changed history by closing a door. But the battle at Hougoumont was nowhere near finished. Jérôme, watching the gate assault fail, became more determined rather than less. He brought up additional artillery to shell the buildings directly. French guns at close range began punching holes in the chateau walls. One round shot killed 4 guardsmen with a single strike as they clustered at a window. The chapel took a direct hit that shattered its altar. Another shell struck the barn roof, starting a fire that quickly spread. The barn was full of wounded men, British, Hanoverian, and Nassau soldiers too injured to fight but mobile enough to have retreated from the outer positions. Maybe 200 wounded were sheltering in the hay when the fire started. The building went up like kindling. Men tried to crawl out. The French, seeing movement in the barn doorway, shot at anyone who emerged. Wounded soldiers had to choose between burning alive or being shot trying to escape. Most burned. Their screams carried across the battlefield for the next hour as the barn collapsed into a mass funeral pyre. By 3 p.m., Hougoumont was a smoking ruin under continuous assault. Every building was damaged. Fires burned in multiple structures. Dead and wounded covered every yard of ground. The formal gardens were destroyed. The walls had breaches. Ammunition was critically low. Some guardsmen were down to 10 rounds each. MacDonald's garrison had suffered 30% casualties, but they still held. French troops controlled the woods and had penetrated the eastern orchard again, but they couldn't get past the walls in strength. Every assault broke against British musketry and determination. Wellington sent no reinforcements. He did send another ammunition wagon and a brief note telling MacDonald that the success of the entire battle depended on Hougoumont holding. No pressure. The Guard's commander read the note, burned it in a fireplace — the chateau had no shortage of fires — and returned to directing the defence. His men were exhausted, low on ammunition, surrounded by corpses. They held anyway because Wellington said to hold and Guards obeyed Wellington. Jérôme Bonaparte had now committed his entire division plus parts of 2 others to taking the chateau, roughly 10,000 men engaged in what was supposed to be a demonstration. Napoleon watched this through his telescope and sent increasingly furious orders to Jérôme. Take Hougoumont or withdraw. The prince couldn't do either. His attacks failed, but his pride wouldn't let him quit. He kept feeding troops into the assault, wasting men who should have been available for the main attack on Wellington's centre. The strategic failure was complete. Hougoumont had become a French tar pit that swallowed entire brigades without result. The mathematics of the siege were absurd. Roughly 1,200 British and German defenders — the garrison had taken casualties but received a few reinforcements — were tying down 10,000 French attackers. Those 10,000 Frenchmen represented nearly 15% of Napoleon's infantry strength. They were achieving nothing except dying in impressive numbers around an estate that had no strategic value except as a magnet for French stupidity. Wellington had baited a trap with stone walls and British guards. Jérôme had swallowed it whole. Around 4 p.m, French artillery set fire to the chateau's main building. The structure was ancient, dry timber and plaster, and it burned enthusiastically. Guardsmen on the upper floors had to evacuate or be trapped. They fell back to the ground floor and courtyard, maintaining firing positions at windows and loopholes even as flames consumed the building above them. The heat became unbearable. MacDonald pulled his men out of the burning building and concentrated defence on the courtyard walls and the remaining structures — the chapel, the gardener's house, the barn ruins. The chapel somehow remained mostly intact despite the surrounding devastation. A wooden crucifix inside survived the fire that destroyed the rest of the building. French shells had blown away 3 walls and the roof, but the crucifix hung undamaged on the remaining wall. Guardsmen defending the chapel ruins noted this miracle and took it as a sign. British propaganda later made much of the surviving crucifix as proof of divine favour. More practically, the chapel ruins provided excellent firing positions that commanded the south approach. By 5 p.m, Hougoumont had been under continuous assault for over 3 hours. The chateau was destroyed. Bodies carpeted the grounds. Estimates later put French casualties around the complex at 5,000 dead and wounded. British casualties were perhaps 500, mostly in the later hours as ammunition ran low and fighting became close quarters. Jérôme's division was shattered, and the chateau still hadn't fallen. Guards were literally fighting in ruins while buildings burned around them, and they held because Wellington said to hold. The Iron Duke's army might be infamous, but these guards were proving themselves the stubbornest troops in Europe. Napoleon finally sent direct orders pulling Jérôme's remaining forces back from Hougoumont. The attack had failed. Worse, it had wasted precious time and troops for zero gain. The Emperor needed every man for the climactic assault on Wellington centre, yet thousands were dead or wounded around a burning chateau that meant nothing. The demonstration had become a disaster. Wellington's trap had worked perfectly, and in the centre and left of the battlefield, the real fighting was about to reach crisis point. D'Erlon's 16,000 infantry reached the base of Wellington's ridge at 2 p.m. in 4 massive columns, each division advancing separately with drums beating and eagles flying. The formations were wrong. Divisional commanders had misunderstood D'Erlon's orders and deployed in different configurations. Donzelot's division marched in battalion columns, relatively flexible. Marcognet's division formed a single enormous mass 200 men wide and 24 ranks deep. Quiet's division split the difference. De Ruyter's division on the far left advanced in standard column of divisions. The inconsistency meant the assault would hit Wellington's line in uncoordinated waves rather than one devastating hammer blow. French skirmishers ranged 200 yards ahead of the columns, firing at anything that moved on the ridge. British skirmishers from the 95th Rifles shot back with Baker rifles that could kill at 300 yards. Green-jacketed riflemen picked off French officers with methodical precision. Each time a French captain or major fell, the column behind him hesitated. Sergeants filled the gaps and the advance continued. But the psychological effect of seeing leadership systematically destroyed was cumulative. The columns slowed to a crawl as they climbed the muddy slope. Allied artillery opened fire when the French reached 800 yards. British 9-pounders and Dutch-Belgian 6-pounders threw solid shot into the dense masses. Each ball that struck a column travelled through multiple ranks before stopping. One shot could kill or maim 10 men. The French couldn't return fire. Their supporting artillery was too far back to reach Wellington's guns. D'Erlon's men had to endure the bombardment without response. Bodies piled at the front of the columns as rear ranks stepped over their own dead to maintain formation. The Allied guns switched to canister at 400 yards. Tin cans filled with musket balls that turned cannon into giant shotguns. Each discharge sent 80 balls screaming into the columns at waist height. Entire files disappeared. The French advance became a slow-motion slaughter. Officers kept the columns moving by sheer force of will, knowing that stopping under artillery fire meant annihilation. The only safety was closing to bayonet range where British guns couldn't fire without hitting their own infantry. Wellington's infantry waited behind the ridge crest, invisible to French gunners and mostly protected from the canister fire decimating D'Erlon's troops. British battalions lay in the mud in 2-rank lines, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. The waiting was worse than fighting. Men could hear the French drums, the screams of wounded, the artillery fire. They couldn't see anything. Battalion commanders stood behind their lines, watching for the columns to crest the ridge. The moment French shakos appeared over the ridgeline, officers would give the order to stand and fire. Marcognet's massive division hit Wellington's left centre first, climbing the slope in a formation so dense that men in the rear ranks couldn't see forward. The column was roughly 200 men wide and 24 deep, nearly 5,000 troops compressed into a space 200 yards across. British defenders couldn't see this mass until it topped the ridge barely 100 yards away. Suddenly French infantry appeared, drums beating, voices roaring, "Vive l'Empereur!" The psychological impact was tremendous. Facing 5,000 screaming Frenchmen at close range broke lesser armies immediately. Wellington's infantry stood up on command. Picton's division, British and Hanoverian brigades, formed a line facing Marcognet's column. The mathematical advantage shifted instantly. A column 200 men wide could only present 200 muskets in the front two ranks. British two-rank lines stretching 400 yards could present 1,600 muskets, 8-to-1 firepower advantage for the defenders. British officers ordered companies to fire in sequence. The volleys began. The first discharge dropped the entire front of Marcognet's column. 200 men fell in 3 seconds. The second volley hit before French sergeants could close the gap. Another 200 casualties. The column recoiled, then steadied as veterans in the rear ranks pushed forward. French troops tried to deploy from column into line to match British firepower, but deployment under fire was nearly impossible. Men fell as they tried to move into position. The formation became a confused mass taking sustained musket volleys at 80 yards. Marcognet personally led his column forward, trying to close the distance before British firepower destroyed it entirely. His troops made it to within 40 yards before Picton's division fired a general volley, every musket along the line discharging simultaneously. The sound was like canvas tearing, magnified 1,000 times. The smoke was so thick that neither side could see the other. When it cleared, Marcognet's front ranks were gone. The column had stopped advancing. French soldiers were firing back, but their musketry was ragged. Individual shots versus disciplined volleys. Picton ordered the 92nd Highlanders to charge. These Scottish troops had been waiting for this moment. They surged forward with bayonets, screaming Gaelic battle cries. The psychological shock of Highlanders in kilts charging through smoke broke Marconnet's already shaken division. The French column dissolved. Men ran rather than face cold steel. The Highlanders pursued, killing fleeing Frenchmen and capturing a regimental eagle, one of Napoleon's most sacred symbols. Marcognet's 5,000-man division had been shattered in under 10 minutes, but Picton had fallen. The British general took a musket ball through the temple during the firefight, killed instantly. His division didn't know their commander was dead until after they'd routed the French. Picton's ADC kept the death secret to prevent panic, propping the general's corpse upright on his horse and leading the animal to the rear as if Picton was wounded but alive. The deception worked until the body was discovered an hour later. Donzelot's division hit the British centre seconds after Marcognet's collapse. These French troops advanced in more flexible battalion columns that could deploy quickly. They also had better luck. They struck a weak point where British and Dutch-Belgian troops met. The Dutch-Belgians fired one volley, saw the French masses continuing forward, and began falling back. A brigade commander rode among his troops trying to restore order. His men ignored him. The retreat accelerated toward panic. British troops to the right of the wavering Dutch-Belgians held firm, creating a salient as the line bent backward. Donzelot's column exploited the gap, pushing forward into Wellington's position. For several minutes the battle hung in balance. If the French could widen the breach, they'd split Wellington's army and roll up both flanks from inside. The Duke personally rode to the threatened sector, pointed his cane at a British reserve brigade, and ordered them forward at the double. The 1st Brigade, 3 battalions of foot guards, marched into the gap and formed line facing Donzelot's column. These were the same guards regiments holding Hougoumont, different battalions from the same elite units. They fired volleys at point-blank range into the French column, stopped its advance, then counter-attacked with bayonets. Donzelot's division broke and ran. The gap was sealed. Wellington's line held. On the British left, Keart's division assaulted the position around La Haye Sainte farmhouse. Major Bering's King's German Legion riflemen had been fighting off French skirmishers since morning and were nearly out of ammunition. Quiet's troops surrounded the farm, attacking from multiple directions. The German defenders couldn't cover every approach. French soldiers broke into the barn and fought room to room through the complex. Bering's men fell back to the main farmhouse, barricading doors and firing from windows. The farmhouse became a miniature fortress within the larger battle. French troops controlled the barn and orchard but couldn't take the main building. Every window was a firing position. Every doorway was a death trap. Bering's riflemen had maybe 30 rounds each remaining. They made every shot count. French casualties around La Haye-Sainte were mounting faster than they could evacuate the wounded. Keogh realized the farm couldn't be taken by infantry assault alone. He needed artillery support or he'd waste his entire division on the buildings. De Ruyter's division on the far left advanced toward Papelotte and the eastern edge of Wellington's line. These Dutch-Belgian and Nassau positions were less robust than the British centre. De Ruyter's columns drove in the outposts and began infiltrating the farm complexes. The defenders fought building to building but were gradually pushed back. Wellington sent Hanoverian reinforcements to stabilise the sector. The Germans arrived just as de Ruyter's lead elements were consolidating their gains. Close-range firefight erupted among the farm buildings. Neither side could gain advantage. Then British cavalry appeared. Lord Uxbridge commanded Wellington's cavalry reserve, the Household Brigade and Union Brigade, roughly 2,500 heavy cavalry positioned behind the ridge. Uxbridge had watched d'Erlon's assault develop and made a command decision without consulting Wellington. He would charge the French columns while they were engaged with British infantry. The timing was perfect. French troops were disordered, taking casualties, focused forward. They wouldn't see cavalry coming until too late. The Household Brigade, Lifeguards and King's Dragoon Guards in red coats and brass helmets, charged first. They crested the ridge at full gallop and hit the flank of Keogh's division near La Haye-Sainte. French infantry tried to form square to defend against cavalry, but they were too close to the farm buildings and too engaged with Bering's riflemen to manoeuvre properly. The British cavalry crashed into them like an avalanche. Heavy cavalry versus infantry in the open was slaughter. The horses weighed half a ton each and were moving at 30 miles per hour. The impact of a cavalry charge physically knocked men down. Sabres rose and fell. French soldiers who stood were cut down. Those who ran were ridden down. Quiet's division disintegrated in minutes. The cavalry rode through them, over them, scattered them across the slope. Hundreds of Frenchmen threw away their weapons and ran. The Union Brigade, Scots Greys, Royals and Inniskillings charged simultaneously at Marconnier's and Donzelot's already retreating divisions. These Scottish and Irish cavalrymen in grey coats smashed into the French columns and destroyed them as organised forces. The Scots Greys became legendary for riding alongside fleeing Highland infantry and rallying them with shouts of "Scotland forever." Combined infantry and cavalry pursued the French down the slope, capturing 2 more regimental eagles and killing hundreds. The British cavalry charge was perfectly executed and tactically brilliant. It had shattered d'Erlon's entire corps, captured 3 eagles, killed or wounded thousands of Frenchmen, and relieved the pressure on Wellington's line. Then it became a disaster. The cavalry didn't stop. Uxbridge had ordered them to pursue to the bottom of the slope and return. Instead, blood-mad and exhilarated by success, they kept going. The Household and Union brigades charged across the valley toward the French lines. British heavy cavalry reached Napoleon's Grand Battery, the massed artillery that had been bombarding Wellington's ridge all morning. Cavalrymen sabred French gunners and spiked cannon. For several glorious minutes they rampaged through the French artillery park, destroying guns and scattering crews. Then French reserves counterattacked. Cuirassiers and lancers, thousands of fresh French cavalry, hit the exhausted, scattered British horsemen. The British cavalry was too deep in enemy territory, too dispersed, and riding blown horses. French cuirassiers in armour cut through them systematically. The lancers were worse. Their 9-foot weapons could kill from beyond sabre range, spearing British cavalrymen who couldn't reach them. The charge became a rout in reverse. British cavalry fled back toward Wellington's Ridge, pursued by French horsemen killing stragglers. Lord Uxbridge tried to rally his cavalry for a defensive stand. Maybe half responded. The rest were scattered, dead, wounded, or running for their lives. French lancers hunted British cavalry across the valley, killing men and horses alike. The Scots Greys, who charged with 400 men, came back with 100. The Union Brigade lost half its strength in 10 minutes. The Household Brigade fared slightly better but still took brutal casualties. The cavalry charge had cost Wellington half his heavy cavalry. Roughly 1,200 troopers killed, wounded, or captured. In exchange, he'd destroyed D'Erlon's corps as an effective fighting force and bought himself time. The mathematics favoured Wellington slightly. French losses were higher and included 3 eagles, a blow to morale. But the Duke had lost irreplaceable troops. British cavalry couldn't be replenished easily. D'Erlon's infantry, though shattered, could be reformed from survivors and reserves. Napoleon still had the larger army. More critically, Wellington now had almost no heavy cavalry left to counter future French cavalry attacks. He'd spent his mobile reserve winning a temporary advantage. If Napoleon sent French cavalry against British infantry now, Wellington's troops would have to defend in squares without cavalry support. Infantry squares could stop cavalry charges, but they were vulnerable to artillery and took heavy casualties from sustained attacks. Wellington had traded mobility for time. Whether that trade would prove wise depended on when the Prussians arrived. Marshal Ney watched the British cavalry charge devastate D'Erlon's corps and drew exactly the wrong conclusion. He saw Wellington's Ridge seemingly in chaos. Troops moving, smoke everywhere, formations shifting. Through the haze he observed what looked like a general retreat toward the Brussels road. Wagons were rolling north, infantry were repositioning. The Duke must be withdrawing before the position collapsed entirely. Ney had one chance to turn retreat into rout. He needed cavalry, immediately. The Marshal sent orders for Milhaud's cuirassier corps to prepare for assault. 4,000 heavy cavalry in steel breastplates riding massive horses. These were elite shock troops designed to smash through enemy lines and pursue fleeing armies. Ney planned to throw them at Wellington's supposedly retreating infantry, break the Allied line permanently, and win the battle before 4 p.m. Nobody had authorized this attack. Napoleon was occupied watching the eastern approaches where Prussian forces were appearing in worrying numbers. Ney acted on his own initiative, his judgment clouded by a decade of trauma and desperate need to prove himself. What Ney actually saw was Wellington's careful management of a defensive position. The Duke was moving wounded to the rear, bringing up ammunition wagons and rotating battered units out of the front line. This looked like retreat to an observer watching through smoke from a mile away. It was actually competent battlefield administration. Wellington had no intention of withdrawing. His line was holding. Prussians were marching toward his left flank. Time favoured him. But Ney didn't know this, and wouldn't have believed it if told. At 4 p.m, Milhaud's cuirassiers formed up in the valley between the ridges. 4,000 horsemen in ranks, polished steel breastplates reflecting the afternoon sun. The psychological impact of massed heavy cavalry was tremendous even before they moved. These men and horses represented concentrated violence. Each cuirassier weighed 250 pounds, each horse weighed 1,200 pounds. Together they could hit infantry lines like cannonballs. The cuirasses could deflect musket balls at range. The straight sabres could split skulls. French cavalry had shattered every continental army they'd charged. Britain's square formations had stopped them in Spain, but Ney assumed Wellington's mixed army wouldn't have the discipline to form proper squares under pressure. The cuirassiers advanced at a walk, then trotted, then broke into a gallop as they climbed Wellington's ridge. The ground was still soft from rain. Horses struggled through mud that sucked at hooves and slowed the charge. The devastating impact of cavalry hit at 30 miles per hour. In these conditions, the cuirassiers managed maybe 15. Still deadly, but the reduced speed gave British infantry precious seconds to react. Wellington's troops saw the cavalry coming and immediately formed squares, hollow rectangles of infantry 4 ranks deep, bristling with bayonets on all sides. A properly formed square was nearly invulnerable to cavalry. Horses wouldn't charge a wall of bayonets. If riders forced them forward anyway, the horses shied away at the last second or impaled themselves on the points. The men inside squares fired volleys at approaching cavalry, dropped riders and horses, created obstacles of screaming wounded animals that blocked subsequent waves. The cuirassiers hit the first British squares at 4:15 p.m. Horses refused to charge the bayonet walls. Riders circled the squares looking for gaps, taking musket fire from all 4 faces. Men fell. Horses fell. The cavalry couldn't break the infantry and couldn't retreat because more French horsemen were pushing up the slope behind them. Wellington's ridge became a forest of squares with French cavalry swirling between them, achieving nothing. Inside the squares, British infantry endured hell. The formations were packed tight, men standing shoulder to shoulder in ranks 4 deep. The front rank knelt with bayonets braced against the ground. The rear 3 ranks stood with bayonets pointed outward and upward. Nobody could move. The middle of the square was a death trap. If French cavalry broke through, the formation collapsed and everyone died. Officers and sergeants stood in the square's interior, maintaining discipline by example and threat. Men who panicked were shot. Men who held position lived. Maybe. French cavalry couldn't break the squares, but they surrounded them completely, cutting off retreat. Allied artillery crews servicing guns between the squares had to abandon their weapons and run for the nearest square when cavalry approached. The gunners would shelter in the infantry formations while French horsemen rode past, then rush back to their guns when the cavalry withdrew. This dance repeated dozens of times. Several gun crews were caught in the open and sabred to death. Their artillery pieces sat abandoned between squares, prizes neither side could claim while the fighting continued. Ney watched his cavalry fail to break the squares and sent in more cavalry. Lefebvre Desnouettes' light cavalry division joined the assault. Another 2,000 horsemen, lighter than cuirassiers but more manoeuvrable. Then Guyot's heavy cavalry from the Imperial Guard joined. Napoleon's elite mounted reserve committed without the Emperor's permission. Ney was feeding cavalry into a meat grinder, but he couldn't stop. British squares had to break eventually. Every army broke under sustained cavalry pressure. Wellington's mongrel force couldn't possibly maintain discipline through repeated charges. By 4:45 p.m., roughly 9,000 French cavalry were attacking Wellington's ridge simultaneously, the largest massed cavalry assault in European military history. The ridgetop became a nightmare landscape of horses, smoke, screaming men, and British squares standing immobile while death rode around them. The sound was indescribable. Thousands of horses, thousands of men shouting, muskets firing and volleys, wounded screaming, drums beating somewhere in the chaos. Men inside the squares couldn't see beyond their neighbours. They just loaded and fired on command, trusting that officers knew what was happening. The British squares held because of mathematical firepower and iron discipline. Each square presented 600 to 800 muskets that could fire in any direction. Cavalry charging a square's face took concentrated volleys at 50 yards, then 30, then point blank. Very few horses made it to the bayonet wall before being shot. Those that did refused to impale themselves. French cavalry would ride up to within 10 feet of British bayonets, receive a volley, wheel away leaving dead and wounded. Then another wave would try. Same result. French artillery should have been blasting the squares to pieces while cavalry pinned them in place. Infantry squares were perfect artillery targets, dense formations that couldn't maneuver. A few well-aimed cannonballs could tear through a square's ranks, create gaps, allow cavalry to exploit the breach. But Ney had launched his cavalry charge without coordinating artillery support. French guns couldn't fire at the squares without hitting their own cavalry swirling around them. The gunners sat idle, watching cavalry die because their marshal forgot combined arms warfare's first rule. Wellington reinforced the ridge by bringing up reserve units to form additional squares, creating a defensive checkerboard that covered every approach. If French cavalry broke through one sector, they faced fresh squares behind it. The Duke rode between formations on Copenhagen, his chestnut horse picking its way through wounded men and dead horses. Wellington appeared calm, almost bored. He'd fought cavalry charges in India and Spain. This was larger but not fundamentally different. His squares would hold as long as troops maintained discipline. The first square to waver was a Dutch-Belgian battalion that had formed properly, but whose troops were losing nerve under repeated charges. French cavalry sensed weakness and concentrated on this square, circling it constantly, looking for any gap in the bayonet wall. The Belgian troops held for 30 minutes before their formation loosened. A cuirassier officer spotted the weakness and led his squadron directly at the gap. The Belgians fired a ragged volley that killed some riders, but not all. The cavalry crashed into the square's corner. The formation collapsed instantly. Once cavalry penetrated a square, the interior became a slaughterhouse. Horsemen rode through packed infantry, sabring men who couldn't maneuver. Belgian soldiers threw down weapons and ran. The cuirassiers pursued, cutting down fleeing men. A British square nearby fired volleys at the French cavalry, killing some but allowing others to escape with captured Belgian colours. Wellington noted the disaster and brought up a British battalion to fill the gap. One square lost out of 30. Acceptable casualties. Around 5:15 p.m, Ney personally led another cavalry wave toward Wellington centre. The marshal had 4 horses shot from under him during the battle. He kept finding new mounts and charging again. This charge accomplished nothing except adding Ney's 4th dead horse to the ridge. British squares fired volleys. French cavalry circled. Men died. The squares held. Ney rode back down the slope to organise another assault. Napoleon, watching from La Belle Alliance, finally noticed what his marshal was doing and sent furious orders to stop. The Emperor's cavalry reserve was being wasted in unsupported charges against formed infantry. Cavalry needed infantry and artillery support to break squares, combined arms, not suicide charges. But the orders arrived too late. Ney had already committed virtually every French cavalry unit on the field. Pulling them back now while under fire would create chaos. The charges had to continue until either the squares broke or the cavalry was destroyed. Wellington's infantry was running low on ammunition. Some squares were down to 20 rounds per man. Officers sent desperate messages requesting resupply. Ammunition wagons tried to reach the squares, but French cavalry controlled the spaces between them. Several wagons were captured. Their drivers were killed and their cargoes looted. British troops watched French cavalry ride past carrying British ammunition boxes, unable to do anything about it. The lack of ammunition forced some British battalions to hold fire until cavalry was at point-blank range, conserving bullets for maximum effect. This made charges more frightening because infantry wasn't shooting until the last possible second. Horses would be 10 yards from bayonets before volleys erupted. The psychological pressure was immense. Men wanted to fire early, break the charge before it got close. Officers forbade it. Wait, now. The volleys fired at 15 feet dropped entire cavalry ranks. The survivors wheeled away or died on British bayonets. French cavalry began taking unsustainable casualties. Roughly 3,000 horses were dead or wounded on Wellington's Ridge by 5:30 p.m. Cuirassiers, who'd started the day commanding squadrons, were leading handfuls of survivors. Junior officers were dead. Sergeants commanded troops. The attacks continued because stopping meant admitting defeat. Ney kept sending charges forward, each weaker than the last, each achieving nothing. At 6 p.m, Ney realised the cavalry charges had failed. 2 hours of assault, 12 major charges, maybe 4,000 French cavalry casualties. Not a single British square broken except the Belgian battalion. Wellington's line was battered but intact. French horses were exhausted. The survivors could barely trot, much less charge. Ney pulled back the remnants of his cavalry to the valley between ridges. The greatest cavalry assault in European history had accomplished nothing except proving British squares could withstand anything. Wellington's troops cheered as French cavalry retreated. The sound carried across the battlefield, thousands of voices roaring defiance. Men inside the squares had survived hell. They'd stood motionless while death rode around them for 2 hours. Officers allowed brief celebration, then ordered troops to reform lines and prepare for the next attack. The cavalry charges were over, but the battle wasn't finished. Napoleon still had the Imperial Guard in reserve. The Prussians still hadn't arrived in strength. Wellington still had to hold. The casualties from Ney's failed charges were asymmetric. French cavalry lost perhaps 4,000 men and thousands of horses, irreplaceable losses that crippled Napoleon's mounted arm. British infantry casualties were maybe 2,000, mostly from artillery fire and the few cavalry penetrations that succeeded. The French had traded elite cavalry for British line infantry. Terrible mathematics. But the real cost was time. Ney had wasted 2 hours achieving nothing. Those 2 hours gave Blücher's Prussians time to reach the battlefield, and they were coming. Blücher's advance guard appeared on Napoleon's right flank at 4:30 p.m, emerging from the Paris wood near the village of Plancenoit. General Bülow commanded 30,000 Prussian infantry, who'd marched 11 miles through conditions that should have been impossible. The roads from Wavre were sunken lanes turned to rivers of mud by the rain. Artillery crews had manhandled guns through knee-deep muck for 6 hours. Infantry had marched with mud sucking at boots every step, falling down, getting up, continuing because Blücher rode among them demanding speed. The old field marshal was 72 years old, bruised from being trapped under his dead horse at Ligny 2 days earlier, possibly concussed. He ignored pain and exhaustion because he understood strategic reality. Wellington was dying on that ridge. Save Wellington, destroy Napoleon, end the war. Everything else was irrelevant. Napoleon received reports of Prussian forces at Plancenoit and immediately grasped the crisis. His right flank was empty. He'd positioned everything facing Wellington, assuming Grouchy would keep the Prussians away. Marshal Grouchy was actually 8 miles east pursuing Prussian rearguards toward Wavre, marching away from the sound of the guns. The Emperor had 72,000 men fighting Wellington. Blücher was bringing 50,000 more Prussians who would arrive in waves throughout the evening. The mathematics shifted dramatically. Napoleon now faced potential annihilation if he couldn't break Wellington before the Prussian numbers became overwhelming. The Emperor detached Lobau's 6th Corps, 10,000 infantry, to hold Plancenoit and screen his right flank. Count Lobau was a solid defensive general who understood his mission. Delay the Prussians, buy time for Napoleon to destroy Wellington, retreat if necessary, but slowly. Lobau's troops marched double time toward the village just as Bülow's lead elements entered from the east. The race was on. Plancenoit sat in a valley behind Napoleon's main battle line, a typical Belgian farming village of stone houses clustered around a church. Narrow streets between buildings created natural choke points. The church and cemetery occupied high ground in the village centre. Whoever controlled Plancenoit controlled the approaches to Napoleon's flank and rear. If Prussians took the village, they could advance directly into the French army's vulnerable right side while Wellington pressed from the front. Napoleon would be caught between two armies and destroyed. Bülow's Prussians hit Plancenoit at 5 p.m. with overwhelming numerical superiority. 30,000 attackers against Lobau's 10,000 defenders. The French deployed in the village buildings, firing from windows and barricaded doorways. Prussian infantry advanced in columns through the streets, taking casualties from every angle. The fighting became savage house-to-house combat. Prussians would storm a building, clear it room by room with bayonets, move to the next house. French defenders fell back through the village toward the church. Lobau's troops fought desperately because they knew failure meant disaster. Every minute they held was another minute for Napoleon to break Wellington. The Count positioned himself at the church, rallying troops and directing reinforcements to threatened sectors. Prussian artillery began shelling the village from hills to the east. Buildings collapsed. Fires started. The church bell tower took a direct hit and crashed down into the nave. Lobau held the ruins anyway because losing the church meant losing the village. By 5:30 p.m., Prussian weight was overwhelming French defenders through sheer numbers. 3 Prussians for every Frenchman. Bülow committed his reserves, sending fresh brigades into streets already filled with dead. French troops in the village's eastern half were cut off and forced to surrender. Lobau pulled his remaining forces back to the church and cemetery, forming a final defensive line. The Prussians surrounded this position and prepared for a final assault. Napoleon watched Plancenoit's fall through his telescope and made a critical decision. He couldn't afford to lose his right flank. Wellington's line was holding despite Ney's cavalry charges. The Prussian threat was immediate and growing. More Prussian corps were approaching behind Bülow. The Emperor needed to stabilize his right before the situation became irretrievable. He detached 8 battalions of the Young Guard, 4,000 of his best remaining infantry, and sent them to retake Plancenoit. The Young Guard were Napoleon's second-tier elite troops, veterans with years of service but not quite good enough for the Old Guard. They marched toward Plancenoit in perfect formation, drums beating, eagles flying. Their arrival changed the tactical situation instantly. These weren't line infantry who might break under pressure. These were guard troops who'd never been defeated. They hit the Prussians in Plancenoit at 6 p.m. with bayonet charges that drove through the village streets like sledgehammers. Prussian infantry couldn't stand against guard troops in close quarters. The Young Guard's discipline and ferocity overwhelmed the attackers who'd been fighting for an hour and were exhausted. Building by building, the French retook Plancenoit. Prussians fell back to the eastern edge of the village, regrouped, counter-attacked. The Young Guard held them off with concentrated musket volleys. By 6:30 p.m., the village was back in French hands. Napoleon's flank was secure, temporarily. But the Prussian assault on Plancenoit had accomplished its strategic purpose even in failure. Napoleon had been forced to commit 14,000 troops, Lobau's corps plus the Young Guard, to defend his flank. Those 14,000 men were unavailable for the attack on Wellington. The Emperor's numerical advantage had evaporated. He now had roughly 58,000 troops facing Wellington's 68,000 on the main battlefield. while another 30,000 Prussians pressed his right, and more Prussian corps were marching toward the sound of the guns. Blücher understood he didn't need to break through at Plancenoit immediately. Every Prussian attack forced Napoleon to divert resources from fighting Wellington. Every minute the Emperor spent watching his right flank was a minute not focused on breaking the British centre. The old Field Marshal kept feeding troops into Plancenoit, accepting heavy casualties because the strategic return was worth it. More Prussian brigades arrived from Wavre and joined the assault. The village changed hands twice more in the next hour, each time costing both sides hundreds of dead. Wellington received reports of the Prussian arrival at 5 p.m. and allowed himself brief satisfaction. Help had come. Blücher had kept his promise despite age, injury and impossible conditions. The Duke still had to hold his line, but now he was fighting for time until Prussian numbers overwhelmed Napoleon rather than hoping to survive until nightfall. The strategic calculus had shifted dramatically. Wellington sent a liaison officer to coordinate with Bülow and request that Prussian forces press Napoleon's flank aggressively. Keep the pressure on. Force the Emperor to commit reserves eastward. Every Frenchman fighting Prussians was one not fighting British. But Wellington's position remained critical. Ney's cavalry charges had stopped, but French artillery was still pounding the Allied line. La Haye-Sainte farmhouse was under continuous assault. Major Bering's German riflemen had held all day, but were down to their last ammunition. Once the farm fell, French guns could be brought up to within 200 yards of Wellington's centre and blast his infantry to pieces. The Duke needed Bering to hold until the Prussian pressure on Napoleon's flank became unbearable. Napoleon understood the race against time perfectly. Prussians were arriving in increasing numbers. His window to defeat Wellington was closing. The Emperor had one trump card left: the Imperial Guard. These were his elite of elites, the veterans who'd marched from Lisbon to Moscow, the troops who'd never been defeated in battle. Roughly 15,000 Guard infantry remained uncommitted, the Middle Guard and Old Guard, the finest soldiers in Europe. Napoleon had saved them for the decisive moment. That moment was now. At 6:30 p.m, French forces launched a renewed assault on La Haye-Sainte. This time Ney coordinated infantry, artillery and cavalry properly. Guns hammered the farm buildings while infantry advanced under covering fire. Bering's riflemen returned fire despite having maybe 10 rounds per man remaining. They sent desperate messages to Wellington requesting ammunition. None came. The supply wagons sent earlier had been captured or destroyed. The King's German Legion troops in La Haye-Sainte would have to hold with bayonets or not at all. French infantry surrounded the farm and attacked from all sides simultaneously. Bering's 400 defenders couldn't cover every approach. French troops broke into the barn, the courtyard, the orchard. The German riflemen fell back to the main farmhouse, fighting room to room. Their ammunition ran out completely around 6:45 p.m. Bering ordered evacuation. Staying without bullets meant annihilation. The King's German Legion troops retreated out the back of the farmhouse and ran for Wellington's line, pursued by French infantry. Half were killed or captured during the withdrawal. Bering escaped with maybe 40 men. La Haye-Sainte had fallen after 9 hours of defence. The farm's capture gave Napoleon exactly what he needed. French artillery crews immediately moved guns forward to La Haye-Sainte's walls and began firing at Wellington's centre from 200 yards. At that range, round shot carved through British formations with devastating effect. A Dutch-Belgian brigade taking this close-range bombardment broke and retreated without orders. Wellington's centre was collapsing. The Duke committed his last reserves, British Guards from his right flank, to plug the gap. The line held by meters. Napoleon watched La Haye-Sainte fall and recognised his opportunity. Wellington's centre was weakened, under artillery fire, and running out of reserves. The British right had been stripped to reinforce the centre. Prussians were pressing Plancenoit but hadn't broken through. The Emperor had maybe 1 hour before Prussian numbers became overwhelming. 1 hour to break Wellington and win the battle. He ordered the Imperial Guard to prepare for assault. 5 battalions of Middle and Old Guard infantry, roughly 5,000 men, would advance on Wellington's centre-right, smash through the weakened British line, and split Wellington's army. Once the Guard broke through, the rest of the French army would exploit the gap. Victory would follow. The Imperial Guard formed up in columns around 7 p.m. These were the Emperor's finest troops, men who'd served 15 years, veterans of 100 battles. They wore distinctive tall bearskin caps that made them appear larger than life. Their officers were legendary, colonels who'd been with Napoleon since Italy, generals who'd commanded armies. The Guard had attacked rarely. Napoleon saved them for crucial moments. When they advanced, battles ended. Enemy armies broke and ran rather than face the Guard. This was psychological warfare as much as military assault. Napoleon personally inspected the Guard battalions before they stepped off. He rode along the columns on his white horse, saying nothing but making eye contact with his veterans. The Emperor's presence meant everything. These men would die for him without hesitation. They believed in Napoleon's genius, his destiny, his invincibility. The Guard had never been defeated in an attack. Tonight wouldn't be the first time. At 7:15 p.m., as the sun dropped toward the horizon, the Imperial Guard began marching toward Wellington's ridge. Drums beat the pas de charge. The columns advanced in perfect formation despite the mud and the dead horses littering the slope. Every French soldier who could see them stopped fighting to watch. The Guard advancing meant Napoleon had committed his final reserve. Either they would break Wellington or the battle was lost. There was no middle ground. Wellington watched the Guard columns climbing toward his position and recognized the crisis. His centre-right was defended by battered British battalions, depleted Dutch-Belgian units, and Hanoverian troops who'd been fighting all day. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and demoralized by the artillery fire from La Haye-Sainte. If the Imperial Guard hit them in this condition, they might break. The Duke needed his best troops in position to meet the attack. He pulled the 1st Guards Brigade from the reverse slope where they'd been sheltering and positioned them directly in the path of the advancing French columns. British Guards versus Imperial Guard, the elite of both armies meeting in the climactic moment of the battle. The Prussians chose this moment to launch their largest assault yet on Plancenoit. 30,000 fresh Prussian troops, additional corps that had just arrived from Wavre, hit the village from multiple directions. The young guard defending it were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Prussian infantry poured into the streets, accepting horrendous casualties, but advancing through weight of bodies. Napoleon watched his right flank disintegrate and made a terrible choice. He pulled 2 battalions of Old Guard, his absolute final reserve, from the main attack and sent them to hold Plancenoit. The assault on Wellington would proceed with fewer troops than planned because the Emperor couldn't afford to lose his line of retreat. The Old Guard battalions marched into Plancenoit at 7:30 p.m. and stabilized the situation through sheer professional violence. These were Napoleon's oldest, most experienced soldiers. They counterattacked through the village with bayonets, driving Prussians back into the streets and killing them in the confined spaces. The Old Guard cleared Plancenoit house by house, showing why they'd never been defeated. But the cost was strategic disaster. Napoleon had committed his final reserve to defending a village instead of breaking Wellington. The Emperor's margin of error had disappeared completely. On Wellington's ridge, the Imperial Guard columns were approaching the British line. 5,000 Frenchmen in their bearskin caps, advancing in perfect formation, drums beating, eagles flying. This was Napoleon's last throw of the dice. Everything depended on the next 30 minutes. The Imperial Guard's approach created a silence that spread across the battlefield like a physical force. French troops who'd been fighting all day stopped to watch. British infantry lying behind the ridge heard the drums and understood what was coming. Wellington's army had faced veteran French infantry, elite cavalry, massed artillery. They'd never faced the Imperial Guard in a frontal assault. These were the troops who'd broken Austrian centres, smashed Prussian lines, shattered Russian squares. The Guard didn't lose. Armies facing them lost. 5 battalions advanced in echelon, staggered columns that would hit Wellington's line in sequence rather than simultaneously. The 1st Battalion, 3rd Grenadiers led, followed by the 4th Grenadiers, then 3 battalions of chasseurs. Each column contained roughly 1,000 men in a formation maybe 60 wide and 16 deep. They climbed the muddy slope at a steady pace, maintaining alignment despite the terrain. Officers marched at the front. Drummers beat the rhythm. Nobody ran. The Guard advanced with the mechanical precision of soldiers who'd done this 100 times. Wellington positioned himself directly behind the 1st Guards Brigade. British elite troops he'd concealed behind the ridge crest in a sunken lane. The Duke had learned in Spain that revealing his dispositions early allowed French commanders to adjust. Better to hide strength until the critical moment. The 1st Guards Brigade lay flat in the lane, invisible to French observers. 1,500 British Guards in red coats, veterans of the peninsula, the best infantry in Wellington's army. They waited with loaded muskets while the Imperial Guard climbed toward them. The French column approached the ridge crest, believing they faced a weakened British line. Wellington's centre-right had been pounded by artillery from La Haye-Sainte for the last hour. Dutch, Belgian and Hanoverian troops defending this sector were depleted and demoralised. The Imperial Guard expected to brush aside these battered units with minimal resistance. Their drums beat louder as they neared the ridgetop. Officers drew swords. The columns dressed their lines one final time. At 40 yards from the British position, the Imperial Guard could see the ridge crest but no defenders. Wellington's reverse slope positioning meant the French climbed toward what looked like empty ground. The lead column increased pace, eager to crest the ridge and deploy for the final push. They were 10 yards from the summit when Wellington gave the order. The 1st Guards Brigade stood up from the sunken lane in perfect unison. 1,500 British Guards appeared as if conjured from earth, forming a 2-rank line 300 yards long at point-blank range. The French column's front ranks froze, confronted by a firing line where they'd expected scattered resistance. Wellington's voice carried across the position with parade ground clarity. The British Guards levelled their muskets. Time compressed. The volley erupted at 30 yards, a wall of lead from 1,500 muskets firing simultaneously. The sound was a single enormous thunderclap. Smoke obscured everything. When it cleared 3 seconds later, the front ranks of the Imperial Guard column were gone, 300 men down in an instant. The column staggered but didn't break. French sergeants pushed forward to fill the gaps. The Guard had taken worse casualties before and kept advancing. They'd never faced British close-range volley fire while climbing a slope in column formation. The 1st Guards Brigade fired a second volley before the French could respond. Another 300 casualties. The Imperial Guard column was losing cohesion. Men in the rear ranks couldn't see what was happening at the front through the smoke. They just knew the column had stopped advancing and people were screaming. Officers tried to deploy the column into line to match British firepower, but deployment under sustained volleys at 30 yards was impossible. Men fell while attempting to manoeuvre. General Maitland commanded the British Guards Brigade. He'd fought in Egypt, the Peninsula, and a dozen smaller actions. He recognized the moment when an enemy formation reached its breaking point, the instant when discipline cracked and troops became a mob. The Imperial Guard was there. Maitland ordered the charge. 1,500 British guards surged forward with bayonets. The psychological impact broke the French column completely. The Imperial Guard had advanced expecting easy victory. Instead, they'd lost a third of their strength in 90 seconds to an enemy who'd appeared from nowhere, and now that enemy was charging with cold steel. The column's rear ranks, unable to see clearly through smoke and pressed bodies, heard screaming and metal clashing. Panic rippled backward. Men who'd never retreated began falling back. The Lead Guard battalion withdrew in relatively good order initially, veterans maintaining formation even in retreat, but the withdrawal exposed the 2nd Guard battalion climbing behind them. This column took British musket volleys while trying to understand why their comrades were retreating. They faltered. Wellington's artillery, positioned on the ridge flanks, opened fire with canister at close range. Each discharge sent 80 musket balls into the packed column. The 2nd Battalion broke and ran. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Guard battalions never reached the ridge crest. They saw their sister battalions retreating down the slope and lost confidence. Officers tried to rally them. Some battalions reformed and attempted to advance again. British artillery and musket fire shredded these renewed attacks. By 7:45 p.m, all 5 Imperial Guard battalions were in retreat. Not defeated in detail through careful tactics, smashed in under 30 minutes by concentrated firepower and one perfect volley at point-blank range. A single voice somewhere in the French ranks screamed the impossible phrase, "La garde recule." The Guard retreats. The word spread like fire through Napoleon's army. Soldiers who'd fought all day, who'd taken terrible casualties but held position because the Emperor was winning, heard that the Imperial Guard was retreating. The Guard never retreated. If the Guard was falling back, the battle was lost. French units began withdrawing without orders. Wellington recognized the crisis point instantly. The French army was wavering. One push could turn wavering into rout. The Duke rode forward to the ridge crest, took off his hat, and waved it toward the French lines. Every British soldier understood the signal. General advance. Wellington's entire line stepped off, moving forward for the first time all day. Drums beat. Bugles sounded. 68,000 Allied troops began marching downhill toward the French positions. The Imperial Guard's retreat became a rout. Battalions that maintained formation dissolved into streams of running men. Officers tried to stop them. Some Guards troops turned and fought. Most ran. The psychological damage was catastrophic. French line infantry, seeing the Guard flee, abandoned their positions and joined the retreat. Artillery crews limbered guns and pulled back. Cavalry that had charged all afternoon sat on exhausted horses and watched the army disintegrate. Napoleon personally attempted to rally the Guard. The Emperor rode among the retreating battalions, shouting for them to reform. Some troops responded, forming squares to cover the retreat. Most ignored him and kept running. This was unprecedented. The Guard obeyed Napoleon absolutely under all circumstances. Their flight meant the army's collapse was total. The Emperor's presence couldn't stop it. Ney appeared beside Napoleon, uniform torn, face blackened by powder smoke, on his 5th horse of the day. The Marshal tried to organise a defensive line with Guard remnants and rallied line troops. A few thousand Frenchmen formed squares and conducted a fighting withdrawal. The vast majority ran toward the Brussels road, the only escape route from the battlefield. The road became clogged with fleeing soldiers, abandoned wagons, wounded men, and artillery trying to escape. Wellington's advancing line crashed into the fragmentary French resistance and swept it aside. British infantry who'd stood all day taking casualties finally got to attack. They advanced in lines that maintained cohesion even moving downhill through mud and corpses. The discipline was remarkable. These troops had every reason to dissolve into pursuit and plunder, but officers kept them under control. The advance was methodical, professional, devastating. Prussian forces at Plancenoit heard the sounds of Wellington's advance and renewed their assault on the village. The Old Guard battalions holding it were exhausted and running low on ammunition. Prussian numbers were overwhelming. Blücher had committed over 40,000 troops to this sector. The Old Guard fought building to building, but by 8 p.m. the Prussians had forced them out of Plancenoit. Napoleon's line of retreat was compromised. The Emperor attempted to establish a final defensive line at La Belle Alliance, the inn that had served as his command post. Several Guard battalions rallied here along with remnants of line regiments. They formed squares and prepared to sell their lives covering the army's retreat. Wellington's advancing troops hit this position at 8:15 p.m. The fighting was brief and savage. The French squares held for minutes, taking volleys from 3 sides before breaking and running. Napoleon rode through the chaos trying to find units that would still fight. His Imperial Guard, the corps that had never been defeated, was scattered across the battlefield in tiny groups conducting desperate rearguard actions. The Emperor's world was collapsing. He'd gambled everything on breaking Wellington before the Prussians arrived in force. The gamble had failed. Now his army was disintegrating and 2 enemy forces were pursuing. The retreat became a nightmare. The Brussels road couldn't handle the volume of traffic trying to escape. Wagons overturned. Guns were abandoned when horses couldn't pull them through the mud. Infantry threw away weapons and equipment to run faster. Prussian cavalry hunted the fleeing French, killing stragglers and cutting down anyone they caught. The Prussians had marched 11 miles to reach this battle. They weren't letting Napoleon escape easily. Blücher personally led the pursuit despite his age and injuries. The Field Marshal understood that destroying Napoleon's army tonight would end the war permanently. A defeated army that escaped intact could be rebuilt. An army annihilated during retreat was finished. Blücher committed every available cavalry unit to the pursuit. Prussian hussars and uhlans ranged ahead of the main force, attacking French columns and preventing them from rallying. Wellington's army was too exhausted to pursue aggressively. British troops had stood on that ridge for 9 hours, taking everything Napoleon could throw at them. They'd won, but the victory had cost them dearly. The Duke halted his advance at the Brussels road and let the Prussians conduct the pursuit. British and Allied troops collapsed where they stood. Some slept on the battlefield among the corpses. Others searched for wounded comrades. The fighting was over. The killing continued elsewhere. Napoleon's retreat became a massacre. French soldiers fleeing through the night were hunted by Prussian cavalry who showed no mercy. The roads toward France filled with abandoned equipment, guns, wagons, supplies, even the Emperor's personal carriage with his treasure chest. Prussian troopers captured Napoleon's silver dinner service, his maps, his correspondence. The Emperor escaped on horseback with a handful of guards, riding through the darkness toward Paris and political death. By midnight, Napoleon's army had ceased to exist as an organized force. Perhaps 30,000 troops had escaped in relatively good order. Another 25,000 were dead or wounded on the battlefield. The remaining 17,000 were scattered across the Belgian countryside, disarmed, captured, or hiding. The army that had threatened to reconquer Europe was destroyed in a single day. The Emperor who'd won 60 battles had lost the one that mattered most. Wellington met Blücher at La Belle Alliance Inn around 10 p.m. The 2 commanders embraced on horseback, the British general and the Prussian field marshal, who'd combined their armies and destroyed Napoleon. They agreed Blücher's forces would continue the pursuit while Wellington's troops rested. The old field marshal rode off into the night, still hunting Frenchmen at 72 years old. Wellington returned to his headquarters and began the grim accounting of what victory had cost. The battlefield at Waterloo was a vision of hell. 15,000 Allied dead and wounded lay on the ridge and slopes. 25,000 French casualties filled the valley and approaches. 40,000 total casualties in an area 3 miles square. The wounded screamed for water, for help, for their mothers. Surgeons worked by lantern light, amputating limbs and trying to save lives. The dead would wait until morning. There were too many to count in the dark. Wellington walked through his headquarters, seeing the cost of victory in the missing faces. Staff officers who'd been with him all day were dead. Aides he'd sent with messages hadn't returned. His army had won the greatest battle of the age and paid a price that made the Duke weep. He later wrote that nothing except a battle lost could be half so melancholy as a battle won. Standing in the darkness at Waterloo, surrounded by the sounds of the dying, Wellington understood exactly what he meant. Blucher's cavalry pursuit continued through the night with methodical savagery. Prussian hussars riding fresh horses hunted exhausted French infantry along every road leading south from Waterloo. The fleeing soldiers threw away muskets, packs, and ammunition to run faster. It didn't help. Prussian sabres cut them down in the darkness. Villages along the retreat route became slaughterhouses as French troops seeking shelter were cornered and killed. The old field marshal had ordered no quarter for Napoleon's army. This wasn't battle anymore. It was extermination designed to ensure the emperor could never rebuild his forces. French troops who tried to surrender were often killed anyway. Prussian soldiers remembered Ligny 2 days earlier, when Napoleon's forces had crushed their comrades. They remembered years of French occupation, requisitions, and humiliation. Revenge drove the pursuit as much as military necessity. Prussian cavalry officers who tried to accept surrenders found their troopers ignoring orders and killing Frenchmen regardless. The pursuit became a running massacre that continued until dawn. Napoleon's Imperial Guard conducted the only organised retreat. Perhaps 4,000 Guards infantry formed hollow squares and withdrew in formation despite Prussian cavalry harassment. They moved slowly, stopping periodically to fire volleys at pursuing horsemen. The squares bristled with bayonets that kept cavalry at bay. Prussian hussars circled these formations but couldn't break them. The Guards' discipline held even in defeat. These veterans understood that breaking formation meant death. They marched through the night, losing men to artillery and musket fire but maintaining cohesion. The emperor rode among these guard squares for several hours before his escort convinced him to leave. Napoleon's presence attracted Prussian attention and endangered the troops protecting him. Around 2 a.m., he departed with a handful of cavalry officers, riding hard for the French border 40 miles south. The guard squares continued their withdrawal without him, fighting rearguard actions that bought time for other French units to escape. By dawn on June 19th, most of the surviving guard had crossed into France. They'd lost half their strength, but remained the only French unit that could claim it hadn't been routed. Wellington spent the night of June 18th at his headquarters in the village of Waterloo, compiling casualty lists by candlelight. The numbers were devastating. 15,000 Allied casualties, 8,000 British, 4,000 Hanoverian, 3,000 Dutch-Belgian and others. Some British battalions had lost 60% of their strength. The 27th Foot went into battle with 750 men and came out with 250. The 92nd Highlanders, who'd captured a French eagle, suffered 65% casualties. Wellington's elite guards brigades were shattered. The cavalry that had charged so brilliantly in the afternoon was gone as an effective force. The officer casualties were proportionally worse, Picton dead. Delancey, Wellington's quartermaster general, mortally wounded by a cannonball that caught him at the base of the spine. He'd die in agony 3 days later. Lord Uxbridge had his leg shattered by grape shot in the battle's final minutes and required amputation. The Duke's personal staff had taken brutal losses. A third of his aides de camp were dead or wounded. Wellington had sent young officers with messages all day, and many hadn't returned. The empty faces around him at headquarters told the story of victory's price. Gordon, Wellington's favourite ADC, had been killed by a musket ball in the afternoon. The Duke learned about it hours after the battle ended. Gordon had been with Wellington since the Peninsula, a competent officer who understood the general's thinking without requiring detailed orders. Now he was dead on the ridge along with thousands of others. Wellington went into his private quarters and wept. His public face was iron control. In private, the cost broke him temporarily. The battlefield itself defied description. Dawn on June 19th revealed 3 square miles carpeted with dead men and horses. The bodies lay in patterns that told the battle's story. French columns piled at the ridge crest where British volleys had stopped them, cavalry dead in rings around British squares, artillery crews sprawled by their guns. The concentration was highest at Hougoumont, where 10,000 casualties filled the grounds. The chateau itself was a burned ruin. The barn where wounded had burned alive was a collapsed heap of charred timbers and bones. Looters descended on the battlefield before the wounded were even collected. Local Belgian civilians stripped corpses of anything valuable: boots, uniforms, weapons, personal effects. Some looters killed wounded men who resisted. British and Prussian troops joined the looting despite orders against it. Gold teeth were pulled from the dead. Rings were cut from fingers. The wounded begged for water and received bayonets instead if they carried anything worth stealing. Wellington sent provost marshals to stop the plundering, but 3 square miles of corpses couldn't be policed effectively. The wounded suffered worse than the dead. Battlefield medicine in 1815 meant amputation without anaesthesia or pain management. Surgeons worked in farm buildings converted to field hospitals, sawing off shattered limbs while patients were held down screaming. The survival rate for major amputations was perhaps 30%. Abdominal wounds were death sentences. Surgeons couldn't operate on internal injuries. Men with belly wounds were left to die over hours or days. The screaming continued for 3 days after the battle, as wounded men succumbed to shock, infection, or blood loss. Captain Cavalier Mercer commanded a British horse artillery battery that had fought all day in the centre of Wellington's line. His battery had fired over 700 rounds, suffered 140 casualties from 200 men, and lost half its horses. Mercer walked the battlefield the morning after and described it as resembling a vast slaughterhouse. The smell was already overwhelming: blood, excrement, and decomposition in summer heat. Bodies bloated quickly. Burial parties couldn't keep pace with the dead. Mass graves were dug, but thousands of corpses remained unburied for days. The Prussian pursuit had driven what remained of Napoleon's army 30 miles south by June 20th. Blucher's cavalry hunted stragglers all the way to the French border. French casualties during the pursuit exceeded battle casualties, perhaps 8,000 killed during the retreat versus 25,000 at Waterloo itself. The Prussians captured Napoleon's personal baggage train, including his campaign treasury, maps, and correspondence. They seized or destroyed 220 French cannon abandoned during the rout. The Emperor's army lost more equipment in retreat than it had lost fighting. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st and found his political support had evaporated. News of Waterloo had preceded him. The French legislature demanded abdication. The Emperor's marshals, the generals who'd followed him for 15 years, told him the army was finished and couldn't fight again. Napoleon initially resisted. claiming he could raise new forces and continue the war. His advisors presented him with reality. The army was destroyed, the treasury empty, the British and Prussians marching on Paris. Continuing meant France's annihilation. The emperor abdicated for the second time on June 22nd, 4 days after Waterloo. He named his son Napoleon II as successor, but nobody took it seriously. The dynasty was over. Napoleon fled Paris hoping to escape to America. He made it to Rochefort on the Atlantic coast before British ships blockaded the harbour. Realising escape was impossible, he surrendered to HMS Bellerophon on July 15th. The British government exiled him to St Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic where he couldn't threaten Europe again. The man who'd conquered a continent spent his last 6 years on a rock in the ocean. Wellington returned to Brussels and then London as a hero. King George III made him a duke. He'd been an earl before Waterloo. Parliament voted him £200,000 in prize money. The public celebrated him as Britain's greatest general. But the Duke found victory's aftermath deeply unsatisfying. He destroyed Napoleon at terrible cost. The ridge at Waterloo had consumed his army. The men he'd commanded for years in the peninsula were dead or crippled. Military glory looked different when you'd seen 15,000 of your soldiers killed or wounded in a single day. The battle's strategic consequences were immediate and total. Napoleon's defeat ended 23 years of near-continuous European warfare. The Congress of Vienna, which had been negotiating Europe's post-war settlement, reconvened and finalised borders that would largely hold for a century. France was reduced to its 1790 borders and occupied by Allied troops. The Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII. The revolutionary and Napoleonic period was finished. But the human cost extended far beyond casualty lists. 40,000 men killed or wounded at Waterloo in 9 hours created 40,000 individual tragedies. British soldiers who survived with amputations returned home to find no pensions and no jobs. The government had promised support that never materialised. Former soldiers begged in London streets. The wounded French were worse off. Their government had collapsed and couldn't pay promised benefits even if it wanted to. The battlefield at Waterloo became a tourist attraction within months. British visitors travelled to Belgium to walk the ridge where Wellington's army had stood. Guides showed them where the Imperial Guard had attacked, where the cavalry had charged, where famous officers had died. Entrepreneurs sold battlefield souvenirs, musket balls, uniform buttons, pieces of equipment. The commercialisation was grotesque but lucrative. The field where 40,000 men had become casualties was now entertainment for the upper classes. The dead were buried in mass graves that were later disturbed for commercial purposes. Entrepreneurs discovered that battlefield bones could be ground into fertilizer. In the 1820s and 1830s, companies excavated the Waterloo mass graves and shipped bones to Britain where they were processed and sold to farmers. The men who died fighting for Europe had their remains converted to agricultural products. Even death at Waterloo offered no peace. Wellington lived another 37 years after Waterloo, serving as Prime Minister and elder statesman. He never spoke gladly of the battle. When pressed for details, he emphasised the horror and waste rather than the glory. His famous quote, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won," summarised his view perfectly. Victory at terrible cost was still terrible. The men who died didn't care that their side won. The myth of Waterloo began forming immediately and bore little resemblance to reality. British historians portrayed it as a triumph of British discipline and Wellington's genius over French aggression and Napoleon's tyranny. They downplayed the Prussian contribution despite Blücher's 50,000 troops being essential to victory. They ignored the fact that only 1/3 of Wellington's army was British. The narrative became, plucky Britain defeated the continental tyrant through superior character and leadership. The truth was messier and more interesting. Wellington commanded a polyglot force that shouldn't have functioned at all. 6 languages, mixed experience levels, questionable loyalty in some units. He won through defensive positioning, artillery placement, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to retreat when any reasonable commander would have withdrawn. Napoleon lost through overconfidence, poor subordinate management, and catastrophic timing mistakes. The Prussians turned possible British victory into certain French destruction through Blucher's determination to march 11 miles through mud and arrive when needed most. The battle itself wasn't the tactical masterpiece of myth. It was a brutal, confused 9-hour slugfest where both sides made mistakes and thousands died for yards of muddy ridge. The outcome hung in balance for hours. If Ney hadn't wasted 2 hours on unsupported cavalry charges, if Napoleon had attacked 3 hours earlier, if the Prussians had arrived 2 hours later, if La Haye-Sainte had held 30 more minutes, any of these changes might have produced a French victory. But Wellington's army had won through endurance rather than brilliance. British infantry squares had held against cavalry that had broken every continental army. The guards at Hougoumont had defended ruins for 8 hours against overwhelming numbers. The line on the ridge had taken artillery bombardment, cavalry charges, and infantry assaults without breaking. This wasn't genius tactics, it was stubborn refusal to lose. Wellington's real achievement was holding together an army that had every reason to fall apart until the Prussians arrived to finish Napoleon. The men who stood on that ridge on June 18th, 1815, didn't feel like heroes. They felt exhausted, traumatized, and lucky to be alive. Many suffered what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, inability to function in civilian life. Victorian Britain had no support systems for damaged soldiers. They survived, or they didn't. The myth of Waterloo celebrated glory and triumph. The reality was closer to horror and waste. Wellington understood this. The soldiers who'd been there understood this. Everyone else believed the myth. And the myth mattered because it shaped how Britain saw itself for a century, as the nation that had stood alone against tyranny and won through character rather than numbers. The truth that Wellington's army was multinational, that victory required Prussian help, that the battle was desperately close. These facts were ignored in favour of a cleaner narrative. Waterloo became Britain's foundation myth for the imperial century that followed. The men who'd actually fought there knew better, but nobody asked them. Heroes weren't supposed to complain about trauma.